Good afternoon. It's really good to be here. I think I have the most difficult time slot of the day. But thank you for being here, and thank you to the Economic Society of Singapore and SUSS for this invitation to speak. I was asked to speak on the topic of inequality and social good, and I'm responding to this prompt by drawing from things I have learned through various research projects that I've been involved in since the mid-2000s. You will see that although I refer to some specific findings from projects, most of the presentation sketches out broad patterns and themes without necessarily going into details of particular studies. So if people are interested, I'm happy to wade into the weeds later during Q&A. Let me begin by anchoring my presentation around three key questions that I think are crucial to ask when trying to get at the topic of social good and inequality. First, what do people need to lead meaningful and flourishing lives? What social conditions enable people to pursue the lives they would like to lead? How do these conditions vary along class and gender lines? So needs, conditions, variations. So the first question is, what do people need to lead meaningful and flourishing lives? This question can seem endlessly subjective and difficult to pin down. Who is to say what a meaningful or flourishing life is? Is it possible to answer this question in a general or universal way? Scholars from a range of disciplines, philosophers, political theorists, economists, sociologists, have in fact tried to pursue the answers to this question. In various ways, they've worked to define its parameters concretely, to make the case that while variation is inevitable, there are still claims we can make that reflect broad agreements and consensus. Over the past 5 years, together with a team of researchers, I've been involved in research to establish a minimum income standard in contemporary Singapore. The purpose of the work is to establish, through focus group discussions with ordinary Singaporeans, to establish what basic standards of living in Singapore should entail and what household budgets will be necessary to meet these basic needs. The research design was organized around capturing not just individual desires for things, but social norms around basic needs. The work has resulted in 2 reports, one we published in 2019 and another last year in 2021, which you can access from our study website. From what I've described, you may already have noticed that the study's design did not start with the language of a meaningful and flourishing life. Instead, we used the language of basic needs and basic standards of living. What is really interesting and profoundly significant then is that as people told us what they thought basic needs in Singapore today are, they were the ones to emphasize and insist that life isn't just about and should not just be about staying alive, about survival. A basic standard of living cannot merely be about food, clothing, and shelter, cannot just be about staying alive. It also has to be about living a meaningful, good life. Our study captured some level of individual idiosyncrasies, meaning some individual tastes and preferences. But importantly, the study was aimed at taking the temperature on social norms. And this turned out to find resonance in how ordinary people think about human needs. That humans need some level of autonomy, where they can exercise preferences and choices, but humans also live in society, and so they also have needs for interdependence. Living a decent life is only possible when one has access to respect, belonging, dignity, and these are social and relational qualities. So we drew from multiple rounds of focus group discussions across 3 languages, and we ended up crafting this definition. I offer it here as one way of thinking about what people need to live meaningful and flourishing lives. A basic standard of living in Singapore today is about, but more than just, housing, food, and clothing. It is about having opportunities to education, employment, and work-life balance, as well as access to health care. It enables a sense of belonging, respect, security, and independence. It also includes choices to participate in social activities and the freedom to engage in one's cultural and religious practices. You will see here what I mean about autonomy and interdependence, that people place great emphasis on choice and preferences, but also on respect and belonging. I hope you also noticed, looking at this definition, that when we talk to people in different age group and different times during the life course, we also found, of course, that different parts of this definition take on varying levels of salience and importance at different times in life. A child of 5 years old, a student finishing up their O-levels, a single parent of a teenager, a married father with 2 young children, a retiree at age 70, these people will have different priorities as well as different sources for meeting their needs. And these variations are important to keep in mind. They indicate that in society, in any society, in order for everyone to be able to meet needs and live meaningful, flourishing lives at all points in the life course, a great deal of attention must be given to social conditions that enable this possibility. So this brings me to my second question. What social conditions enable or disable people to pursue the lives they would like to lead? There are many, and I'm not an expert on them all. Some of the other speakers today, in fact, cover some of the other areas, and I believe more will after I speak. If we unpack what people's needs are and what it would take to enable them to meet these needs, we have to include in our discussion things like food systems and their integrity, environmental protections and justice, laws or regulations safeguarding religious participation, political institutions, and civil liberties. The point is that although we often think about the fulfillment of needs as individual quests, it is impossible to fulfill these needs in the absence of all this social infrastructure. So for today's talk, I only want to focus on 2 aspects of social conditions. So, wage work and care infrastructure. Since this is where most of my research is focused, I will focus on just these 2 conditions. Now, income can come from many sources, and where they come from vary for different types of households at different stages of the life course. But wage work is crucial, both as a means to an end and as an end in itself. In a capitalist economy, wage work is the primary means for most people to generate income to meet their wide range of needs. It is also, on its own terms, something that generates meaning and respect. When scholars talk about wage work as a site for understanding social conditions, what we refer to are things like this: the availability of wage work conditions, so things like schedules, flexibility, security, leave provisions, bargaining power of workers vis-a-vis employers, and of course, the level of wages. And the discussion of wage work can never be separated from that of care and care infrastructure. Because at the same time that people are at the part of the life course where they participate in wage work, they are also responsible for a range of care needs for children, for older persons, or for disabled family members. Care infrastructure refers to the entire constellation of things that allow for care and wage work to be pursued simultaneously. So we're referring here to paid caregivers, institutions of care such as childcare centers, caregiver leave, and the various laws, subsidies, or regulations that may affect the prices of care services or the opportunity costs of leaving wage work to care. Discussions about wage work and care infrastructure does not mean that I'm primarily interested in the needs of people in the middle part of the life course, or only on dual wage worker households. Instead, most people, regardless of age and role in a family or household, are entangled in the tension between the demands of wage work and responsibilities of care. Another way of saying this is to say that this is not just a work-life balance problem for the working adult. The lives of everyone, the daily rhythms and schedules they live by, the possibilities for their present and future, are tangled up at this intersection of wage work and care. This has become especially obvious to me in recent years as I've been interviewing working parents about their children's schedules. We don't typically think of work-life balance as a child's problem, but indeed, when they do their homework, when they attend tuition and enrichment activities, what kind of leisure they do or do not have, how and with whom children spend their days, these are all dependent on the constellation created by their parents' work conditions, the caregivers their parents rely on, and the time and money their parents have or do not have for paid activities. This brings me then to a final question. How do social conditions vary along class and gender lines? In recent decades, there has emerged globally an increasingly polarized job market in which the quality of jobs have been very divergent. We've seen divergence in wages, schedules, stability, bargaining power, provisions for time off, autonomy, respect, and dignity afforded to workers. Job quality and employment relations are poor for those with lower levels of educational attainment. Work is precarious and uncertain for people with fewer credentials. Care gaps are also more pronounced for workers with less leverage in the labor market and fewer resources to outsource care labor. On the other hand, those with skills, credentials, and cultural and social capital to get top jobs have benefited greatly since compensation for certain types of jobs have soared. The market for providing care services have expanded for those with the ability to pay, and so care gaps are resolved differently across class lines. Gender also matters. Women play larger roles as caregivers. They face greater challenges to reconcile wage work and care responsibilities. Men play smaller roles as caregivers and larger roles still as breadwinners. Women are more likely than men to adjust their relationships to wage work in order to carry out care labor, resulting in both wage differentials as well as different labor force participation patterns. Now, it's important to emphasize that these are not merely outcomes of some static traditional culture, but they illustrate the ways in which public policy, by enabling or incentivizing certain gendered parental roles and practices and not others, contributes to the thickening and persistence of inequalities. Money is not everything. Money cannot buy happiness. Money cannot buy respect. Dignity is more important than money. These are tropes that are often repeated, and they are wrong. It may be true that money cannot directly buy any of these things, but money is absolutely a precondition to them. Money can buy a HDB flat so a person can live as a typical Singaporean does, where their children can have their own bedrooms as they grow up. Money can buy the clothes that one needs to show up appropriately dressed at a wedding, and then other clothes so that they can fit in at the office. Money can buy a birthday present so that a child can go to their friend's party and feel proud rather than embarrassed. Money can allow a retiree to donate money to their religious group, and this allows them to feel they still contribute and belong to society. These are all things that respondents and focus groups told us they need. Wage conditions and care infrastructure shape people's access to money. Since social conditions or wages and care vary along class and gender lines, The capacity to earn and accumulate money to meet short and long-term needs is also variant. And this variation is something we should care very much about because it indicates that the right to live meaningful and flourishing lives, not a controversial right to get behind, the right to live meaningful and flourishing lives is not equally accessible. Let me return to this question. What do people need to lead meaningful and flourishing lives? The question of social good needs to be posed in this way, placing ordinary people in the middle as protagonists. Not experts, not politicians, not ideologues, not pundits. People in the middle as protagonists. Using this question to orient us shapes how we proceed with figuring out the answers. For me, as a sociologist and a researcher, it means doing research that takes seriously that people's experiences and perspectives can shed light on social phenomena. It means actively pursuing empirical data aimed at centering ordinary people as protagonists. And from this, what I've found are the things I've shared today. That first, while this is not an easy question to answer singularly, certain needs can meaningfully be considered universal in a given society and moment. It is possible and useful in broad terms that allow for idiosyncrasies and variations to conceptualize needs in this way. It is useful because it provides a starting point for us to deliberate as a society how to ensure that everyone in society can lead meaningful and flourishing lives. Second, to do this, to aspire to better for everyone, we have to look closely and carefully at the present. And here is where a consideration of these questions are key. In a context where humans share so many of the same needs, whose needs are well beyond met, whose needs are just met, and whose needs are not met at all? Why do these variations exist? What are the conditions necessary for meeting needs? And how do people with the same needs come up against different conditions? In the pursuit of everyday lives, working, housework, caring for kids, helping children with homework, supporting aging parents, upscaling and retraining, leisure, I have found through various research projects that people of different class backgrounds have to devise quite different strategies because they face different conditions in all this nitty-gritty material that makes up life. Women and men are faced with different options as they try to pursue meaningful lives. They give up their own needs to different degrees. Variations per se are not a problem, and we live in a diverse society where variations should be expected. But we're not talking merely about difference or diversity in a horizontal way. We're talking about hierarchy, about inequality in outcomes, about the uneven meeting of what people need to lead flourishing lives. Let me emphasize again, too, that people have needs for both autonomy and interdependence. The notion of needs I've sketched out, which draws from ordinary people's experiences as well as aspirations, is not about crafting selves that are selfish, individualistic, and atomized from society. Here is a notion of a self that is deeply embedded in the social. The needs are drawn from social norms. They reflect consideration of the needs for self and others. And central to these needs are those for social connection. As we go about pursuing our needs for food, clothing, housing, education, employment, social activities, healthcare, security, respect, belonging, we encounter many agents and institutions. We come into contact with markets, with schools, with employers, with hospitals, with banks, with various state agencies, including either their regulations or their human representatives. Through these encounters, we learn about how society defines who belongs and who does not, who deserves and who does not, what one should do to try to deserve and what one cannot possibly change if one is not deserving. We learn about individual responsibility and how no one owes us a living, about the massive spoils that go to winners as well as the proverbial cracks losers may fall through. We learn, in other words, some things about how the game is played. Despite there being a strong social dimension of people's imaginations of needs, there is also a strong sense that the game is primarily an individual hustle. With this in mind, many actions are oriented toward one's own family and one's own children, and many are oriented to the short term. There is very little space in this daily hustle for doings and beings that are oriented toward shared well-being and societal good. Earlier, I emphasized ordinary people's articulation of individual and social aspects of their needs. There is a key tension and paradox I've noticed while interviewing people across the years. There is, on the one hand, a strong imagination of society and social well-being, and on the other, a kind of retreat into the individual cocoon of the family and into practices that maximize individual familial interests. And the tension exists, I think, partly because despite a turn toward greater neoliberal market fundamentalist orientations in more recent decades, there is still also a nation-building developmentalist orientation living within our polity and society. This push and pull between the social and the individual, between greater good and self-interest, between social well-being and individual gains, is surely one of the central concerns of any society, particularly given political polarization and the large-scale collective action challenges posed by the climate crisis. So what? What's at stake when there are universal needs and when there are uneven conditions as people try to meet them? I'd like to end by suggesting that what's at stake when we have such inequalities are not problems of marginal outliers, problems we can ghettoize as problems of a small minority. What's at stake cannot just be fixed by plugging gaps. How people meet their needs matter. The conditions, economic, social, political conditions, including the laws and regulations and policies that make up the content of these conditions. These conditions that people encounter matter very much for shaping the texture and possibilities for our social politics. As people negotiate social conditions, certain habits and practices develop, certain common sense beliefs form. That is the material forming our social and political culture. Current ways of meeting needs emphasize and feed into individualistic rather than solidaristic orientations. We can think of what's at stake also in terms of stasis versus dynamism, a system that doesn't or cannot reconsider and revamp its fundamental assumptions and principles in light of changing material realities versus a system that does and can. There are macro political economic ways to think about this. The problems to be addressed in the world today include rising income and wealth inequality, the resulting disproportionate power of the wealthy and unelected to influence political decisions, and the intensification of political marginalization and precarious lives of the middle class and poor, environmental devastation, including, again, inequality shaping both its causes and impacts. The institutions that currently exist that have a part to play in solving these problems, whether we're talking about states, global governance institutions, banks, corporations, universities, civil societies. After decades of neoliberalist reform and market fundamentalism, these are organized in ways and complex constellations that make it hard to resolve the problems. There are powerful and narrow interests preventing a shift of orientation toward ordinary people's interests and broad social good. So part of the ongoing work of tackling these problems has to involve radical changes to existing institutional arrangements. If we bring this down to a smaller scale, refocusing on the case of Singapore and refocusing on ordinary people trying to meet their needs, an analog exists. Certain things have changed in recent decades which affect the distribution of things and the meeting of needs. The constitution of households and families have changed. The educational